those that were not killed into captivity. What happened to the city? Destroyed. The temple? The palaces? The wall? Destroyed. All of it destroyed. And so we see this is the situation. So if you are an Israelite who has escaped this, and when I say escaped, I mean you're still alive. I don't mean that you got away, but you're still alive. What's your disposition right now? How could God let this happen? Very good. What else? What are we going to do? Yeah, nothing's left.
And they might think, oh, the prophets warned us about this. We did not listen.
That's right. So I think when we put all that together, we get to the book of Lamentations, and we're going to get insight into the mind of the Israelites who have survived this or are living through this. Let me word it that way. You got anything you want to say about this?
Well, just if you look at 15 and 16, some of the language that's used there, I mean, you see how hard God has tried through all this. He sent persistently to them the prophets. And you look at what he has to endure, how they mock and they despise and they scoff. You brought all that up. And then that phrase at the end, I know you mentioned this, but till there was no remedy. What does that mean God was hoping for? God was hoping there would be a remedy, right? There would be something to fix what was going on. The covenant he had made at the beginning, I will be your God, you will be my people. He wanted that the whole time. And then over and over and over again, they reject him. And finally, he's like, well, there's just nothing else to do. There's nothing else to do except this. And he's warned them about how bad it's going to be. But then I think what we're going to see in Lamentations is that I still think it takes them by surprise about how bad it is. And, it's traumatizing.
Yeah. So they are reaping what they have sown. All right? And they've come to realize that. And I think this is the value of the book of Lamentation, I believe, is when we reap what we sow, how do we deal with that? What's the proper way to deal with that? When you're in the midst of the suffering that you have brought upon yourself because of your own sin, what's the proper attitude to have through that? So we'll look at that. Now, when you get to the book of Lamentation, it's got 5 chapters. When you talk about Psalms, the book of Psalms, we talk about it, it has chapters, but really, are those chapters or are they
Something else.
They're something else, aren't they? They're songs. They're poems. And so each one of those is an individual poem. What you have in the book of Lamentation is not 5 connected chapters of a flow of story necessarily.
Just happen to make divisions.
Yes, that's right. But they are 5 different poems, 5 different songs that are there. So just like with Psalms, you have 5 different songs here. And each of them has a different theme. And the themes are connected because they all have to do with what's taken place with the destruction of Jerusalem. But they have a little bit different aspects as we go through there.
So another thing that's interesting about this, and I don't pretend to know, this is not my discovery, I just heard someone else say this, is that the first 4 chapters are poems written in a certain way. So they're called acrostic poems. So the idea is that verse 1 would start with their first letter in their alphabet. Verse 2 starts with the next letter. Verse 3, and then basically they have 22 letters. You'll notice that chapters 1, 2, and 4 have 22 verses each. That's the reason why. Chapter 3 has 66, so that's 3 verses per letter. And so that's going to be kind of, as far as the way they wrote the poem, that was the pattern they were following. So, we often think about poems being written where the last word rhymes or something like that. This is, not all poems are written like that, but this is how they structured theirs.
And of course, that doesn't show up in English because as it's translated, we missed that. But that was in the literary structure in the Hebrew. So let's look at this first poem, chapter 1, or the first poem, and it depicts Jerusalem as a widow who's been deprived of everything that provided for her, and no one takes compassion on her. No one notices her. No one is sympathetic to her. And this is how the Israelites feel at this point. So you look at the first verse. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she who was great among the nations. So here is Jerusalem. that was the place where God chose for his name to dwell, who was to be a splendid place. The temple was there, and now she's lonely. She's a widow. She's not great among the nations anymore. It's destroyed. And so verse 2, she weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. You look at...
you talk about that last line?
I did not.
Well, I think that the very last line of chapter 1, verse 1, she who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. You're going to see a lot of that kind of language, remembering back to what she was, and she is no more, right? You're going to see a lot of that kind of language going throughout Lamentations.
Yes. So look at verse 5. Her adversaries have become the masters. Her enemies prosper. For the Lord has afflicted her because of the multitude of her transgressions. So why is she a widow? Because of her sin. Because of her sin, she's in this situation. Drop down to verse 8. Jerusalem has sinned grievously. Therefore, she has become vile. All who honored her despise her because they have seen her nakedness. Yes, she sighs and turns away. So here's this reversal again that Austin was talking about. People used to honor her, but now they despise her. And the reason? Because she has sinned. The last part of verse 9 there, she has no comforter. Nobody is saying, oh, poor Jerusalem. Because who would say that except them? Their sin is obvious. So look at the latter part of that. Here's what she cries out. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has magnified himself. So I don't think it is that Jerusalem doesn't realize they deserve this punishment at this point. I think maybe they do. But just because you realize, yeah, I deserve this, does that mean that you're happy to bear it? No. And so they're still crying out to the Lord. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay when we are chastened, when we are afflicted because of our own sin, if we cry out to the Lord and say, Lord, notice what I'm going through here. See the anguish and the pain that I'm going through. Maybe think of this as when you are trying to discipline a child. When you're trying to discipline a child and they do something and the natural consequences of that choice is pain on them and affliction, do you want them to recognize that they are in pain and afflicted? Yes, you do, because you're hoping that they'll learn the lesson, they'll get it. If they sit there, if you've got a strong-willed child, which I had a strong-willed child, and you punish the strong-willed child, and the strong-willed child sits there like this, that does not do your heart good. That's not what you're looking for. And you're also not looking for the strong-willed child saying, this is not fair, this is not fair. That's not what you're looking for. You want them to get it. But it's okay if they realize, I deserve this, but this is really hard. This hurts really badly. And I think that's what's going on with Jerusalem at this point.
And so you'll have a lot, even in this first chapter, you have some language where it talks about, it almost sounds, I guess it could be interpreted as if they're blaming the Lord. It's like, Lord, you have done this to us. It's like, okay, well, let's say that you have a child, they've broken a rule, you spank them. And they look at you like, you spanked me. Well, is it your fault? No, it's not your fault as a parent that you've, disciplined them. It's their fault for committing the transgression in the first place. And so what's interesting here is that they will say, you spanked me, that kind of idea. But then they do come back and well, I don't know how far you want to jump. Are you okay to go to verse 17?
No, look at verse 11. You see that here's another one of their pleas at the end of that. See, O Lord, and consider, for I am scorned. And so God recognized that I am afflicted in this. And then in verse 12 also, the end of that, that's what you were talking about, which the Lord has inflicted on me in the day of his fierce anger. And so they recognize, yes, this punishment comes from the Lord. I don't know that they're blaming God for it necessarily, but they recognize that it is come from the Lord.
Yeah, and all that through there is the same kind of language. He spread a net for my feet. You turn me back. He has left me stunned, faint all the day long. His hand, they were fastened together, talking about the yoke, and set upon my neck.
Yes. So how does verse 14, the first verse of 14, read in yours?
The first line.
Yes.
My transgressions were bound into a yoke.
Okay. The New King James says, the yoke of my transgressions was bound. They were woven together by his hands. I like that image. What my sin did is it formed this burden that now I'm having to bear. They recognize that. That is what you're looking for. I'm grieved. I'm scorned. I'm afflicted in this, and yet I did this to myself. My own transgressions formed these chains that are holding me down.
Mm-hmm. And so again, you have all this language about the Lord's, is His hand that's doing this. But then, let's actually look at 18. Is that okay?
Okay.
So in 18, what does the first thing say in 18? The Lord is righteous. Mine says, the Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against His word. But hear, all you peoples, and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and elders perished in the city while they sought food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, for I am in distress. My stomach hurts. My heart is wrung within me, because I have been very rebellious. In the street, the sword bereaves. In the house, it is like death. And so what you see here is they're saying, Lord, you're the one doing this, but are they blaming the Lord? Is the writer blaming? No. They're saying the Lord is righteous. The Lord is right in doing this. This is because of my rebellion, my transgression, you said earlier, my sin. This is the reason that we're suffering this. And so it's good that you have that, because otherwise, in some ways, you probably come away with the impression that they're saying this is God's fault. Right? God's just abandoned us and left us. And it's like, well, He has, but it's not because He just decided to do that. It's because of your transgression. And He's righteous.
You have anything else?
On chapter 1?
Yeah.
I won't say much about this, but at the very end, the last couple of verses there, I think what you have, and you'll have this a couple more times in Lamentations, but you have a call for the Lord to not only maybe relieve some of their suffering, but then judge those who are oppressing them, which is interesting because we've seen God already say this kind of thing with the prophets, where with the prophets He's saying, you're doing evil, you're going to be punished, and then He'll still turn around and say, now you Assyria, you Babylon, you're going to be punished as well because of the evil you've done. And so you kind of have the call for that coming from the other direction. So God's saying, I will do this, but you have the people calling for that at this time as well.
Yeah. So that's the first poem. That's the first song here. Anybody have any comments, anything you'd like to add to that? Since you didn't know we were talking about this, I know it would be tough to have made much preparation in it, but. All right, we'll look at the second then. The second poem deals with God's anger, and that His anger is just, and also the fact that He is faithful to what He promised. I had made this reference before, that Leon Malden slanderously says of me that I had a sign posted in my yard, beware of dog, but I didn't actually have a dog. And so he would say, God is not like Lonnie. God doesn't make empty threats like that. And I think what this second poem does is the people are saying, you know what? When God says something, He means it. He doesn't make empty threats. When He talked about that if we didn't obey Him, bad things would happen, He was right. He was right. So let's look at this. First of all, you have in the first 7 verses, you have this theme that comes up over and over. You see it in the very first line. How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud of His anger. God is upset about this. At the end of verse 1, in His anger. The middle of verse 2, He has thrown down in His wrath the strongholds of the daughter. Verse 3, He has cut off in fierce anger every horn of Israel. Verse 4, standing like an enemy, He has bent His bow. The latter part of verse 4, He has poured out His fury like fire. Verse 5, the Lord was like an enemy. End of verse 6, in His burning indignation, He spurned the king and the priest. So God is very upset with them. His wrath is towards them. They recognize that. God is angry at us. When you discipline your child, is it okay for them to realize, Mom and Daddy are very upset with me? That you want them to see that. Now you don't want to discipline them with outburst of wrath. You want to discipline them in a measured, proper way. But it's okay to be angry at disobedience, and it's okay for them to realize my disobedience has caused them to be angry at me. That's what they are feeling from God right here, and they are right in that. They are right in that. You have anything through verse 7 you want to bring out?
No.
All right, I'm going to skip a lot of this to get to this point, but drop down to verse 14. You have anything before verse 14?
I was just going to talk about verse 9. In verse 9, it talks about the king and her princes are among the nations. The law is no more. Her prophets find no vision from the Lord. That's just a verse where you kind of see them, lamenting what they've lost. So their king has no land to rule. The prophets have nothing to bring from the Lord because the prophecy has come. The law is no more because they no longer are self-governed, that kind of thing. So it's just, it's interesting you see them recognize what they've lost in a lot of this, just beyond things like health or people or, things like that. So it's more their station with the nations around and with God.
Yeah, they were special people and set apart and different, and now they're among the nations, just like everybody else.
Yeah, good point. So you remember if before the siege took place, Jeremiah was prophesying that the Chaldeans were coming and that Jerusalem was going to fall and we need to surrender. What were the other prophets prophesying? Yeah, everything's going to be fine. The temple's here. Nothing's going to happen. The Chaldeans, even if they do come, they'll go back. And then even after the first and second captivity, they're saying, yeah, but in 2 years, everything's going to be different. They're going to send them back home. And Jeremiah basically says, well, let's just wait and see. Let's just wait and see who's right. Look at what they say now, verse 14. Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not uncovered your iniquity to bring back your captives, but have envisioned for you false prophecies and delusions. It's like, Jeremiah was right. All of these guys were liars. But it's a little too late now, isn't it? They understand that, but it's a little too late. Look at verse 17. The Lord has done what he purposed and has fulfilled his word, which he commanded in the days of old. This, I think, is that kind of that highlighted verse there, that God keeps his promises. So the Lord has done what he purposed. He has fulfilled his word, which he commanded in the days of old. So those were not empty threats when God said, if you do not obey me, if you worship other gods, if you do not serve me with your whole heart. Those were not empty threats. Now they see that. Understanding that, and I think we've hit on this already, but boy, we need this lesson because there's always the temptation to say, well, I don't think God would really do that. When we read passages that talk about broad is the way, wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, there are many who go in by that. Do we believe that? Do you think most people believe that? Have you ever gone to a funeral and somebody said, we all liked Joe, but the fact of the matter was he was probably in the broad way? Nobody ever says that. Go to a funeral, everybody's in the narrow way. And yet we know that can't be true. That can't be true. And I think what happens is we begin to believe that God doesn't really mean that. What I want us to see is God means what he says. And so when we see warnings about hell, when Jesus warns us about hell, when he warns us about the consequences of sin, when he tells us, do not be deceived, you will reap what you sow. That is not a false claim. That his bark is not worse than his bite. He's really telling us the truth in that. And we see that from history in the way that he deals with people. Any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, in the rest of the chapter?
Yes, sir.
So in 18:19, I think you have a couple interesting verses where it talks about basically you need to weep. You need to mourn what's going on because of what you've done. But again, you have at the end there the call for the Lord to look at what's happening, and I think implied is to have mercy. It's like, look at the kind of destruction, look at the kind of misery we're going through. They want God to see that. I think because whoever the writer is understanding like that's the only way that they're going to get relief from it is if the Lord is willing to look upon their misery.
Yeah, so let's just, before we go any further, think about in these first two psalms or two poems, how we have this idea when we are afflicted, when we are being chastened because of our sin, the proper attitude in the first is to acknowledge this is happening because of our sin. That's a good thing. And then in the second, that, you know what? God's doing exactly what he said he would do. He kept his word in that. That's good to acknowledge. Now we get to the third. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to say about the second? I'm sorry.
20 is horrifying. What does yours say?
So verse 20.
Yeah.
See, O Lord, and consider to whom have you done this? Should the woman eat the offspring, the children they have cuddled? Should the priest and the prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord?
You're talking about cannibalism?
Yes.
My goodness.
Yes. Which,
That kind of knocked the wind out of me.
yes, that's exactly, which by the way, that's exactly what God prophesied would happen. Remember, the covenant was based upon, if you will be my people, I will be your God, and I will protect you. And I won't let these type of things happen to you. But if you're not my people, then I will turn you over to the nations, and terrible things will happen. The most awful things you could possibly imagine. Like that. Like that. And this will come up again. We get to the third song or psalm or poem, and I'm sorry, it'll be in the fourth one. I'm sorry, I got it confused. In this one, it's talking about here we are being chastened, looking to God, depending upon God. So verse 1, I am a man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. I am one who's being chastened by the Lord. And so, well, what do you see in that? Well, it's very difficult. And all the way through here, he talks about he has aged, verse 4, he's aged my flesh and my skin. My bones are broken. I feel crushed. I feel crushed by this. It's really severe punishment here. It's really difficult. And so that's right. That's what the affliction feels like. You got anything through 21?
Well, just that, with what you're describing here, he feels like he's rotting, he's trapped, he's hunted, he's forgot what happiness is. And then you were talking about verse 20. Right before that, in verse 18, so I say my endurance has perished, so has my hope from the Lord. And so you're just looking at this as he's hopeless. He feels hopeless because of everything that's going on. He's in anguish and he feels hopeless, which is interesting leading into the next part.
Yeah. So that was verse 21?
No, that was verse 18.
Okay, yes.
My hope, so has my hope from the Lord.
Yes.
Perished.
Okay, yes. So in verse 21, this I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. Well, what do you recall to mind that gives you hope? When you are afflicted, when you are reaping what you have sown because of your transgression, what hope do you have? Verse 22. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait on him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke of his youth. Let him sit alone and keep silent, because God has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him and be full of reproach. For the Lord will not cast off forever. Though he causes grief, yet he will show compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. So what is this saying? This is probably the only verse you'll ever see quoted from Lamentation on any type of inspirational thing. Because it's really the only passage in here that's really uplifting. What's the idea? What is he saying?
God is faithful.
God is faithful. To do what?
Keep his promises.
Okay, what promises? What about his character would give them hope here?
His compassion.
His compassion. So we are getting what we deserve. We are reaping what we sow. God has kept his word and he's punishing us just as he said that he would. It feels awful. The hope that we have is if we bear this the way that we're supposed to and we learn the lesson from it that we're supposed to, what do we know about God's character? He loves us. He wants what's best for us. We know that he is a God of mercy. We know that he's a God that has a tender heart. And so as we're bearing this, as we're dealing with this, let's accept it, that we deserve it. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and that's our hope. That's our hope. So, when we are afflicted, when we are crushed, look at verse 29 and 30. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him and be full of reproach. Accept it. Accept all the reproach and recognize, I deserve it. God, here I am before you in this position that I deserve to be in, reaping what I sow. And when God sees that type of humility, when he sees that type of contrition, a broken and contrite heart, these, O Lord, you will not despise, David would say. And so that's the hope that we have. So this is I think this is a wonderful concept that we need to understand, because when we're chastened by the Lord, we have a tendency to blame God or to try to make excuses and say, we don't deserve this. And what this is teaching is no, if you're chastened by the Lord, do not despise the chastening of the Lord. Accept it and depend upon his mercy. Know that he is looking to bring you out of this a better person. So humble yourselves in it. Does that make sense? What would you like to see if you're disciplining a child? What disposition and spirit would you like to see? Yeah, so I remember the very first time that I saw someone discipline, I believe, in a correct way. And I've told you this story before. I was overseas, and Jeff Young had a little Winston who was about 2-3 years old. Winston was playing in the other room, threw a ball, broke some fine china in there. It came in. Dad was upset, but he didn't have an outburst of wrath. He said, explain what you did. I was playing with the ball. Winston's already crying and broke this. And he said, all right, so what do you think? What do you think you deserve? I deserve a spanking. And he's like, all right. So here the boy is crying, saying, I deserve a spanking. Please give me a spanking because I deserve it. What do you think his father's sentiment was? I just want to beat this child. You think that was it? Why? Because he sees his broken heart over this. He's already accepted the correction and the discipline. So I suspect that spanking was not near as hard as if little Winston would have said, I didn't do anything wrong. I suspect it would have been hard then. But you see, we understand that even as human parents. And we look at God and his mercies don't fail. You know, that's the point here. And so accept it, embrace it. When you are guilty, when you are wrong and you're being chastened for it, embrace it and trust in God to be compassionate and merciful. And that's our hope.
So in the rest of the chapter, we kind of have the idea of, well, I mean, it's not an unrelated idea, but it's the idea of, again, God's justice and what he's doing. So you look at 34-36, to crush underfoot all the prisoners of the earth, to deny a man justice in the presence of the Most High, to subvert a man in his lawsuit, the Lord does not approve. Well, guess what these people have been doing? Mm-hmm. These exact things. And so then you get down to verse 39, it says, why should a living man complain, a man about the punishment of his sins? Do they deserve it? Yes, right? So he's saying, look, when we do wrong, God doesn't put up with this. He doesn't approve of this. So then why should we complain whenever God does something about it? I think we've mentioned before about how, God's people were great with God pronouncing judgment on other nations, saying, yep, get them. They're evil. Get them. But then when it turned to them, they usually weren't so keen on that. And what it's saying is, why should we be any different than the nations around us? If we're doing evil like the nations around us, why should we be treated any different? Now look at the conclusion of this. I love the conclusion of this. Verse 40. So this is our state. We shouldn't complain. What should we do? Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. And I love that. Because, again, it's so easy for us, I think, to have the response of saying, well, I don't know why things are going bad. It's just not fair. Maybe it is. Maybe it's fair. Maybe it's just. And maybe what you should do is you should look at yourself and examine your ways and say, I need to return to the Lord. And I love the fact that he's calling the people to do this. And you have similar language throughout. I have a couple that I'm going to mention, but if you have something to say in that part there.
Go ahead.
Okay, well then, so I probably look down at verse 55 and 56. So 55, 56, I have called on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help. So again, we're in a horrible situation. What am I going to resort to? Trying to get myself out of it? No. I'm going to cry out to the Lord, and I know you will hear my plea. And then he spends the rest of the chapter really kind of talking about what his enemies are doing as well. So again, I mentioned this earlier, that you have this kind of idea of God's people are being oppressed, and they're being oppressed because of their transgression, but they are calling for their oppressors to have justice being brought upon them as well. And that's really what the rest of the chapter is about.
And what hope do you have that God's going to take care of those that are mistreating you? What's that? Why do you think that God will do that?
Because the Bible says vengeance is He's just.
He's just. And we know He's just because I'm getting what I deserved. And so if I'm getting what I deserved, I have hope that He'll take care of them too. And I don't have to. And so what Sherry was saying, I don't have to worry about taking vengeance. The Lord will take care of that.
I think the order of these things too is probably important. So it's good that you have, this is the state that we're in. It's our fault. We're going to cry out to you. And then we get to worry about God's justice on others, right? Let's worry about God's justice on us first and how we're going to deal with that and how we should react to that. Then we can worry about the others after that. I think that's probably an important thing to mention as well.
Any thoughts on the third point?
I have a question.
Yes.
So chapter 1 and chapter 2 mainly dealt with Jerusalem and the people. So chapter 3, it starts off, I am the man. So would you say that chapter 3 is kind of like a personal testimony of the author?
It's possible. So, but it's also possible, chapter 1 was about the widow. And so it could be possible that chapter 3 is just an individual saying, I'm a suffering individual with that. But let's build upon that while we're talking about that. Who go ahead.
Well, I think you were about to ask who wrote it.
Yes.
Because that was going to be my question.
Yes.
We've always kind of assumed it was Jeremiah.
Right.
But we don't know for sure.
It doesn't specify who wrote it. It fits with Jeremiah very well because it was somebody who has lived through these things. Jeremiah had lived through these things. And the writing style seems similar to Jeremiah in some places as well. So we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. But it's usually ascribed to Jeremiah. Very good. Anything else in 3? All right, 4. This goes back to what Terry was saying. Chapter 4 describes the horror of the siege of Jerusalem. God in Deuteronomy had described the horror that would come upon them in such things. And here it literally comes to pass. So look at some of the things that take place here. I'm just going to skip through this quickly. Verse 4, the tongue of the infants cling to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. What would be one of the hardest things about being in siege?
Watching your infant child or your toddler suffer.
Yes. Beg for food, and there's nothing to give them. Nothing to give them. Drop down to the latter part of verse 8. Their skin clings to their bones. It has become dry as wood. Those slain by the sword, verse 9, are better off than those who die of hunger. For these pine away, stricken for a lack of fruits of the field. And if you were there day after day for 18 months, remember that siege went on, day after day, no food, there would be days where you would say, it would have been better if we just would have ran outside and they would have cut our heads off than to die like this. Verse 10, the hands of the compassionate woman have cooked their own children and became food for them in destruction of the daughter of my people. That literally happened in sieges. Where, and sometimes it was because the child dies of malnutrition. Well, what are we going to do with the child now? Well, maybe we can survive a little bit longer if we eat the child. I mean, it's hard for us to even fathom thinking that way. But those things took place in sieges like that. Verse 13, because of their sin, because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in the midst the blood of the just. That's why all of this is happening, is because of the sins of the prophets and the iniquity of the priests, leading the people astray, the people wanting to believe that. That's why we're in the situation that we're in. Verse 17, still our eyes failed, watching vainly for our hope. In our watching, we watched for a nation that could not save us. Who are they watching for? They were looking to the south. Is Pharaoh coming with his army to deliver us? And God said, Pharaoh's not coming. He's not going to deliver you. Verse 18, they tracked our steps so that we could not walk in the streets. Our end was near. Our days were over, for our end had come. So this poem and this psalm just goes through and relives the horrors that took place in the siege of Jerusalem and the fall of Jerusalem. Not many happy moments in this one.
So, Mac, did you talk about verse 1 at all?
No, I didn't.
So, what we mentioned this earlier, what was their confidence in whenever they were going to be, when they were in siege for Babylon, saying, oh, we won't fall because the temple. And you have verse 1, how the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold has changed, holy stones lie scattered at the head of every street. It's like, where's your temple now? Everywhere, right? It's just scattered. It's been destroyed. And so that thing you had confidence in, it's gone now. And then I would just want to mention again, so we do often at the ends of these chapters see, again, a focus placed somewhere else. And here we have the same kind of thing. The focus is placed somewhere else, and it says to other nations, the very last line, talking about the Lord, He will uncover your sins, right? So it's almost a warning to these other nations saying, look, don't maybe gloat in this too much. He'll see your sins too, right? He is a just God, and He'll see your sins too. So that's all I have to say about that.
All right, we got 5 minutes. Let's try to get through the last poem here, and that is a prayer for mercy. And this kind of wraps it up, and it's not necessarily... The third poem had that positive moment in it. This one doesn't necessarily have that positive moment, but it directs our minds. So what do we need to do when we're chastened like this? We need to pray to the Lord. We need to cry out to Him. He's the one that can help.
This is also the only one that's not written as an acrostic poem. Yeah. They put 22 verses. I'm not sure why they picked that, but it's not in the same format as the other ones.
Yeah. So verse 1, remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Look and behold our reproach. So God, pay attention to the situation that we're in here. Don't forget about us in this. Anything through verse 14?
No.
Verse 15, the joy of our heart has ceased. Our dance has turned to mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. All right. Notice our situation. We are in this situation. Why? Because we sinned. We acknowledge our transgression before you. Our sin is ever before us, as David would say. Then look at verse... Look at verse 19. Let's just start in verse 19 and read through the end. Oh, you, O Lord, remain forever. Your throne from generation to generation. What about God? God's holy and righteous and great and powerful. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Then look at the plea. Turn us back to you, O Lord, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you utterly reject us and are very angry with us. So the plea is, God, turn us back to you. Bring us back to be your people. We acknowledge our sin. But how does it end? Does it end with God saying, yes, I will? Kind of with a question mark. All right, so what Bible period are we in now? As we end this quarter, what Bible period are we now officially in? Captivity. And that is the question that they have in captivity. Have you utterly rejected us? Is this it? Is this the end? What about all the promises? Is this all there is? is this going to be the last line about Israel and the holy seed? And so that is a very real question in their mind. And as we're going through the Bible story, it's a very real question in our mind as well. And guess what? We're not going to answer it until next quarter. Any final thoughts?
Well, I just might say this about that last line in particular. So you have all throughout a plea over and over again. You have it here. And then mine, at least in verse 21, puts a hyphen. It breaks off the sentence. So renew our days as of old, breaks off the sentence there, unless you've early rejected us. And so it seems to me that this might be at the very end almost an acceptance of saying, well, this is what is to happen and this is what we deserve, right? This is not what I want, but this is what's to happen. This is what we deserve. And again, almost a trust in the Lord's justice in this, I think is good, even if it means bad for them.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, comments?
When we look at the horrors and stuff of the siege, the faithful that listened to Jeremiah wouldn't have experienced that. They would have surrendered to that.
Yes.
If they were allowed.
If they were allowed to, yeah, because Jeremiah had to experience that. But yes, if they were allowed to, they would have spared themselves if they would have listened to Jeremiah. That's right. Very good. All right, let me tell you what we're going to do that's a little bit different this quarter than we've done in the past. Austin and I are going to stay in here after our gospel meeting when we start the new quarter. We're going to stay in here for the first class of the new quarter. And the only reason for that is we're going to do a review of what we covered this quarter. Larson, it's not really fair to the one who's been out there to come in here and try to review material that they haven't covered. And so we felt it would be better for us to stay in one more class, review the material for the teachers that are coming in, and then we'll go back to the high school class, and Larson will, and I don't know who's teaching with Larson this next quarter, but Larson and Colby will pick up with the new material after that. All right, thank you for your good attention. I appreciate that. I'm sorry to spring something on you didn't have time to prepare for, but thank you for humoring us in that. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.